Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Abby Wolf. I'm getting off to a rocky start right now. I'm Abby Wolf. I'm the executive director of the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research. And usually you would see Krishna Lewis here running this show. Krishna directs our fellowship program, but she is out today, so I am stepping in, and it's really a pleasure to do so, given our guests today and the subject at hand. We have a slightly different format today. We have our alumnus fellow and two respondents. So we will, but we'll still be sticking to the same rough time frame that we use. We will have a Q&A at the end for the audience. So you'll use the raise hand function in the reactions tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and I will call on people as much as possible in the order that you raise your hand. So I know that we'll have a wonderful, rich discussion today. And without further ado, let me say it is my honor to introduce the very distinguished Bill Schwarz, who will be presenting his paper, Double Exposure, Race in Britain After Windrush. And Bill was a Stewart Hall Fellow with us during the pandemic. So we've actually never met in person, but I'm used to seeing him in this little square here. So it's nice to be back together with you on screen. In addition to being a much admired alumnus fellow of the Du Bois Institute at the Hutchins Center, he is professor emeritus in the School of English and Drama at Queen Mary University of London. With Catherine Hall, Schwarz is the general editor of the Duke University Press imprint Stewart Hall Selected Writings. In addition to completing a short study of Stewart Hall from Random House, he is also the co-author of Stewart Hall's posthumously published memoir, Familiar Stranger, A Life Between Two Islands. He is also working on a 3-volume history called Memories of Empire for Oxford University Press. The first volume, The White Man's World, was named Book of the Year at the 2013 Longman History Today Awards. This is among the many, many award-winning books he has written and edited on post-colonialism, British cultural and political history, and 20th century Caribbean and North American writers, including Lamming, Lovelace, and Baldwin. As I mentioned, we have two discussants today. Caine Lewin-Turner is one. He is a doctoral student in history at Magdalen College of Oxford and the student convener of Oxford's Race and Resistance program. His research is concerned with comprehending and historicizing Black anarchism. Our other discussion is Saima Nasar. She is lecturer in the history of Africa and its diasporas at the University of Bristol. She also serves as co-director with Madhu Krishnan of Bristol Center for Black Humanities. As a social and cultural historian, Dr. Nasar's work contributes to developing comparative and interdisciplinary approaches in the fields of migration and imperial studies. And we're thrilled to have all of you here. Your work, the work that the three of you do, is very, very important in expanding our understanding of African and African American history and culture, which is what we do at the Hutchins Center. So I will now turn it over to Bill, and I'll see you all in about 40 minutes or so.
Okay, Abby, thank you so much. Krishna, I'm really sorry that you're not there or not here. It's very nice indeed to be back at Hutchins, if only virtually. And I also want to thank Saima and Caine for being kind enough to give up the time and to join me today. So thank you. Thank you to everyone. The title of this paper is Double Exposure of Race in Britain Since Windrush. It should actually be Race in England. I don't know, I think I panicked when I thought up the title and I didn't keep to the more strict concept of England. I'm going to speak for 20 minutes. So I've got 4 little sections. I talk about race as displacement in England, first off. Then I talk about the uses, the memory of Windrush the uses of that memory, how they get articulated and re-articulated. Windrush is it's become the sign for the coming of multicultural Britain. The boat arrived from the Caribbean in 1948. And Windrush is a kind of shorthand for talking about migration. So the second section after race as displacement will be Windrush as dark foreboding. The third part will be Windrush as a sign of England's benediction. And the last one will be Windrush as amnesia. These are very short little points I'm going to be making because time is short. So I'll begin with race's displacement in England. Race is the exposed nerve of the nation. It warns of pains to come, which are lying just around the corner. At its most vocal, race becomes the means for expressing apprehensions of terror and maximally the death of the nation. And by the death of the nation, also that carries with it the sense of the kind of existential collapse of the individual subjects. So there's all those forebodings associated with Windrush, yet at the same time, as this symbolic or real violence directed towards Windrush and what it represents, there are always existed contrary registers in white England about the nature of Windrush. And what we see, or what we've seen since 1948, is a coexistence of violence and civility towards Black Britain or Black England. And this is the double exposure, which my title refers to, that these contrary trends within public life in Britain between civility and violence. The coexistence of the two, violence and civility, is hard to catch. For many West Indians, it was a received truth after the white riots of 1958 that the racial dispositions of the nation had hardened and that Black lives were in the firing line. Yet for all the terror, the Barbadian migrant, George Lamming, was aware of the paradox that even that while all the white riots were happening and violence was meted out to the new Black population in West London, Lamming pointed out that at the same time, the vast majority of the people in this country felt a deep sense of outrage. They felt it was wrong and beastly that such a thing should happen. So what I'm trying to point to are the various spectrums of the different registers of racial whiteness and how within those registers, Black England or Black Britain was conceived. Notable was the structure feeling derived from the belief that the English were providentially free from the incubus of race, and that England had been free from the incubus of race for its entire history. Now, in some ways, one might say that race had never been active in the lives of the English. Why should it have been? England was populated almost exclusively by people with pale skins. Race only arrived when interlopers from distant lands crossed the seas, walked down to the dockside, and stepped onto England's soil. And in doing so, in the eyes of many English people, they brought race with them, or so the English could tell themselves. Now, this overriding displacement of race was the outcome of a history in which the immediate face-to-face work of racial authority, the physical proximity of black bodies and white bodies, had taken place largely overseas, out of sight of the domestic population. In the age of universal democracy, the disavowal of race, the idea that race was not pertinent to England, was a principal means by which racial whiteness in England established its dominance. Now, as I see things, this amounted to the paradoxical racialized disavowal of race. It's a kind of contorted, contrary formulation which we have to stretch for to try and understand how race works in England. The term tries to show how racial whiteness was lived as the non-racial norm. And of course, to England's outsiders, to the migrants, the non-white migrants who came, the presupposition of this entire thought process proved bewildering, as if it were designed to unnerve. Race, in these terms, resisted being named or identified or located. Now, I'm going to talk now more specifically about Windrush and its legacies. And the next section is called Windrush as Dark Foreboding. And I'm going to move to the second decade of the 21st century. In 2012, a menacing shift occurred when the Conservative Party coalition launched what it called its Hostile Environment Working Group. This was chaired by the Prime Minister, David Cameron, and the effect of which, what they sought to achieve, was to re-racialize a generation of West Indian migrants and to relocate those without the correct paper trail, to relocate those culprits to the shadowland or to a new emergent shadowland beyond the nation. The instigators of this conservative strategy strained to show that they were handling the newly incriminated with undisguised state-sanctioned hostility. Now, the term hostile environment had, in fact, importantly, originated from inside the Labour government 5 years beforehand. Now, of course, state hostility to migrants had existed forever. What was new was its strategic centrality as official, publicly aired policy and the collateral effort to induce fear amongst the dark-skinned of the nation's citizens. In a chilling masquerade, this was presented with matchless self-regard as confirmation of the unbending decency of the nation's governors. Virtue abounded. Hostility and virtue become one. Now, the hostile environment was never a political sideshow, the personal fixation of the Home Secretary, Theresa May, although indeed she was zealous in such matters. There was hardly a senior Conservative politician who didn't jump to sign up for the programme. With UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party, the kind of main engine behind popular Brexit, with UKIP breathing down the necks of the Westminster politicians, plan for orchestrating government hostility as a declared political objective speedily coursed through the institutions of the state. They gave to the Conservative and Lib Dem coalition and to its Conservative successors renewed purpose, strategic clarity, and the means to recast the relations between state and citizen, tightening the authority of the former and circumscribing the scope of the latter. After a lifetime of living as British, an aging Caribbean generation, having arrived legally, discovered themselves caught in the state spotlight and classified retrospectively as aliens. The luckless among them returned to lands they either barely knew or didn't know at all. Now, when the personnel of the state departed from their everyday transactions and set off to work with their briefcases or laptops in hand, and when they went about the business of implementing hostility, they carried with them their inherited ways of looking. This is not, or not only, a matter of personal racial antipathy. White resistance to seeing the complexity of Black lives depends on divesting the racially denigrated of their history, leaving them only with their epidermal schema. Race fills the vacuum left by the forgetting of traumatized histories. The misrecognitions of the street, think of Fanon classically, the misrecognitions of the street become institutionalized, reifying and amplifying the categories in contention. There coalesces within the state what Hannah Arendt described as radical thoughtlessness. By this, she meant something akin to social dissociation, prevalent in the functioning of the modern nation states, when official languages are sundered from the embodied lives of the citizens whom governments seek to manage. And it's also when the first person, the I, proves incapable of conceiving or perceiving the reality of others. Bureaucratic logic takes command. Administratively conceived targets systematically subordinate human pain and distress to the greater plan, or more grievously, pain and distress are distributed to those deemed to exist outside the national community. The conservative hostile environment supplies a textbook example of this process. The politicians set out to make hostility happen. As Mrs. May, the Home Secretary, explained to the Conservative Party conference in 2013, her planned immigration bill would encourage the government to get rid of people with no right to be here, even while the criteria for rightful domicile was constantly shifting. The means for getting rid of people proved to be essentially administrative. In the eyes of those who staffed the state, the repeated compilation of dossiers of personal documentation provided the exclusive proof for establishing the truth of one's social existence, ignoring the contingencies of the lives of those who were once citizens who found themselves stripped of their legal rights. Quotas fueled the instrumental logic, working in this case as incentives for the private security services employed to get the job done. Human destinies, staying put or facing removal, became governed by signs on a spreadsheet. Once the putative malefactors were identified and detained in anonymous camps bunkered across the social landscape, the administrative process culminated in setting in motion a system of transportation whose purpose was to carry its manacled human cargo to far-off destinations decreed by the state. Now, on paper, this is a strategy conducted by neutral officers of the state, devoid of personal emotion and without a bigot in sight. Race features in this scheme of thing as merely an unfortunate contingency. That this is so, or can appear to be so, informs a staggering act of dissociation exhibited by the key architects of the policy, Theresa May, Amber Rudd, Priti Patel. The first expressions of public unease towards the hostile environment were evident from October 2017. This evolved into a full-scale scandal, commonly reported as the Windrush scandal. The House of Commons launched an official inquiry, the Independent Review, which was duly published in July 2020. In its quietly forensic prose, it delivered a devastating challenge. May, Rudd, and Patel remained willfully blind to the consequences of their own actions. Those responsible had engineered the hostile environment as a calculated decision. Yet when the scandal broke, they couldn't comprehend the connections between the soulless dreams they pursued and the despair they'd inflicted on others. The review condemned the Home Office, echoing Hannah Arendt, for generating, quote, an institutional ignorance and thoughtlessness towards the issue of race. Even after it had been published, the findings and its findings officially acknowledged, no apology was forthcoming. The perpetrators never apologized. Patel, who was then Home Secretary, insisted that the officials who managed all this were not bad people. When she promised sweeping changes, it was as if the system had arrived like the virgin birth, through no human volition and when no one was looking. Those who had campaigned on behalf of those who had been deported, she identified as do-gooding celebrities. In no way was she or her sisters in the Home Office implicated. She wasn't a bad person, nor was race a material factor. How could it have been when, as Patel was ever keen to explain, she knew racism firsthand? Which prompts us to pursue the question, how indeed? It had all been, it seems, the case of an administrative malfunction, which she pledged to correct. In 2015, Paulette, one of the unfortunate characters caught up in this scheme, received a letter from the Home Office headed by the words, "Notes of Immigration Decision." This is how she learned she's going to be removed or to be got rid of, to employ May's words. It shook her sense of who she was. In her own words, it made me feel like I didn't exist. We can imagine her retreating, like many before her, to a private sanctuary, her suitcase packed, her destiny sealed, and reflecting on the fate of her which her black skin had caused her. And I hope finding what succor she could in her Rastafarian faith. Now, that is Windrush as foreboding. I want to now shift the perspective a little and look at the ways in which, especially recently, Windrush has been repositioned as a sign of England's benevolence, not as a source of terrors to come, pains to come, but of England's benevolence. Now, all through the period from the end of the Second World War to the 1970s, blackness never easily operated as a component in the social democratic consensus or settlement. But there have been countless attempts to try and find some social democratic form of dress which could include the Black population. On the 22nd of June, 2022, which I discovered had been designated as Windrush Day 4 years earlier, on the 22nd of June, 2022, at Waterloo Station, a statue was unveiled. The sculptor was a Jamaican, Basil Watson. The sculpture consisted of a family of Caribbean migrants arriving at Waterloo Station with a cardboard suitcase prominent. The government had paid £1 million towards the making of this Windrush monument, and Windrush Day became established as a moment in the official calendar. The person unveiling the statue was the Duke of Cambridge, Prince William, now, after Prince Charles, destined to be the King of England. He was there with his wife, Kate, looking resplendent in white. There were whiteness embodied. Also there was Baroness Floretta Benjamin, a Trinidadian woman who's part of the kind of greater the good of the British establishment. She had started out life as a TV presenter of children's programs. And there was also the very malicious, difficult man called Michael Gove, who was part of the government at the time. Now, this unveiling of the Windrush Memorial by the future King of England followed the royal tour to the Caribbean in March of this year. Barbados had just broken formal ties with England, and so a royal tour was organized to try and ensure that there was some soft power which Britain could develop to try and keep the Caribbean as a sphere of influence. The destined countries were Belize, Jamaica, and the Bahamas. From the moment the royal couple landed in Belize, it was a PR disaster. There were demonstrations. Belize only has a population of some 400,000, but it looked as if they were all demonstrating. They were all angry. They all hated having these white folk there. And then they went on to Jamaica and Bahamas, and everywhere it was a badly mishandled royal tour. What Prince William was trying to do at Waterloo Station in June is to recover this and to re-articulate how white people should understand the black folk in their midst. And he was word perfect in his rendition of the values of multiculturalism. You know, he had clearly not written it. It had been written by some palace lackey who had probably got a 2-1 from Queen Mary in literature or something. And he said, the past, by which he meant enslavement, the past weighs heavily on the present. He talked about the profound wrongness of the Windrush scandal. He says, without all you black migrants, Britain would simply not be what it is today. And then he said, diversity is what makes us strong. Now, when I saw all this, I was flabbergasted, because how could this exist with the hostile environment? Well, the royal family are a particular dimension of the British state. They represent the ethical state, the universal state, the welcoming state, one to the imperatives of pluralism. 2 days later, after the 22nd of June, after Windrush Day, Prince Charles addressed the Commonwealth leaders in Rwanda, where he expressed his sorrow for the slave past. He said this was a conversation whose time had now come. And then a couple of months later, he was invited to edit Britain's Black London newspaper. So we're presented with this rather panicked, but certainly thought through attempt to think of new ways in which the Windrush story can be retold. Right, I'm coming on to the last section. Abby, I don't know how I'm doing for time.
Go ahead. We want to hear the rest from you.
I've got 2 minutes, 3 minutes.
Yeah, a couple minutes.
Okay.
Yep.
The dominating motif in this new articulation of Windrush is that of the ordinary West Indian, or the ordinary West Indian family disembarking from the Windrush ship and arriving as part of England. That is visually and materially how the story is told. But of course, what this occludes, what it conceals, is in 1981, the state engineered a prolonged assault on the sociality of Black Britain. And it's this history, it's where the state maneuvered itself to break the sociality of Blackness in Britain. It's this which cannot be spoken in recuperations of Windrush today. So in the various public articulations about Windrush, this is never addressed. In the history books, although the police actions, the state actions of 1980 and 81 are recorded, they're often marginalized, and not at all are they seen as anything other than a particular aspect of social life which affected Black people only. This was, in the common sense and in the historiography, the common sense reconstructions, remembering of Windrush, these can only be marginal. And I think this forgetfulness in the name of Windrush, this forgetfulness of the assault on Black Britain is grievous and extremely harmful. Because what's happening for a long time, for centuries, how enslavement and the slave trade has been remembered in public life in Britain is not through the plantation, but through the work that philanthropists in Britain did to secure abolition. So the slave plantation is written out, and the abolition becomes the sign of England benevolence. And I think what's happened now is that the Windrush is being recruited to that kind of structured feeling, that the pain and the traumatized pain is written out of the story. And we have this seamless story now of the good West Indians, the ordinary West Indians, finding a home in a benevolent England. Stop that. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. That was, wow, that was really powerful. and note there, but I'm going to remove myself again, but Caine, thank you for adding to the conversation now.
No, thank you. And yeah, thank you for that, Bill. And before I begin, I just want to thank the Hutchins Centre more broadly for the invitation and all the labour that's gone into making this event possible, as well as express my joy to join Bill and Saima, two theorists who have shaped my, and their guidance as well, shaped my research and my studies. So thanks for that. And as Bill is a big fan of robust discourse and debate, I've opted to lay bare some perhaps disagreeable, but hopefully generative points in the time given to me. So I'm going to begin by asking some loaded questions. On what grounds does the state and its various arms address Britain's racialized communities? And why does history find itself so entangled to the state's desire to dictate racialized discourses, which Bill has kind of touched on? And as I, like Bill, find the state's novel appreciation of multiculturalism and its abridged history both puzzling but significant, I'll center my remarks here on this last question before moving on to reflections on the rebellions of the Thatcher years. I'm going to speak quickly because I know we're pushed for time, but hopefully it's all still there. So historical narratives are, of course, at the heart of ever-shifting categories of race and identity. The salience of critical engagement with their racialized histories the state is willing to sanction and celebrate, a telling example which Bill has touched on, cannot be underestimated. These narratives, plucked from historical reality, stripped of nuance and distorted to fit into a necessary vacuum, offer valuable insight into the state's conception of Blackness and its fluctuating objectives on the ever-present issue of race. The elevation of Windrush as the singular historical signifier of Black Britishness and the belated and shallow apologies for their hostile treatment requires continued public-facing and interdisciplinary attention. As historians of Black Britain, such as Hakeem Addy and Kenetta Hammond Perry have already shown, the Windrush myth's most feared enemy is indeed historical detail. The application of counter-narratives is especially necessary given the predominance of histories which seamlessly segregate the Black from the brown, which celebrate the legals whilst quietly condemning the illegals, as well as the construction of the good and worthy victim against the hidden image of the undeserving deviant. In other words, I'm doubtful that a representative of the royals is preparing a speech on the radical coalition built between Caribbean, African, Asian, and Middle Eastern communities, to name a few, which saw the repudiation of colonialism's racialized divisions of non-whites and construction of a novel identity, which came to be known as political Blackness. And although the notoriety of figures such as Olive Morris has grown in recent years, I doubt our national stories, we'll call it, or the heritage industries are soon to be supplemented by the anarcho principles of Black feminist squatters who saw the destruction of capitalism to be the sole means to eradicate the overlapping forces of racism and sexism. Apologies, like histories, also serve to obscure and dismiss. We are thus unlikely to receive a state-sanctioned expression of remorse for the ongoing mass deportations and torturous experiences of criminalized Black Britons under the broad and elusive banner of public safety. A phenomenon which political philosopher and migrant activist Hope Chilokwe Mullen consistently asserts will never attain the scandal designation from the bourgeois press, nor from state-friendly activists, a claim supported by the foundational sociological work of Luc Denora. Significantly, the Windrush myth provides in its mainstream manifestation a notion of Black movement and societal acceptance contingent upon filling a need for the British state, that is, arrival on these shores on their terms for their benefit. It is on these grounds alone we ought to reject its use. The state's engagement with the histories that we and they consider to be Black is an endeavor to marshal the contours of Blackness and its politics, which left unfettered might conjure up a radically different historical sense of self, one which may begin to reconnect the dots between race and class, a formulation which is at odds with the hegemonic conception of anti-racism as a concern for diversity and inclusion. Such a claim, however, requires a caveat. It is the case that elite Black forces see value in the connotations and objectives of these myths. As Bill mentioned, the choice by the longest-running Black British newspaper, The Voice, to invite the then Prince Charles as the guest editor of its 40th anniversary edition is particularly telling. Such a remarkably tone-deaf, conspicuous act reveals that the hand extended out by the royals is grasped firmly by those who see economic and civil advantages from the state's race marshalling desires. As shocking as this decision was to some Black Britons, the objectives of this publication have been under scrutiny since its fortuitous inception at the denouement of the Black Power Black Power politics in the 1980s. The Black Unity and Freedom Party, one of the foremost Black Power organizations in Britain, condemned the then embryonic newspaper as, quote, the voice of the aspiring Black middle classes and the various sources that support them. That claim turned out to be accurate. I want to therefore reassert, as Bill has, that the Windrush myth, which Prince William attempted to further entrench, serves the state and its protectors, especially at an extended moment of crisis, far more than those engaged in a genuine quest for a liberated future. And I make this suggestion as a proud product of post-World War II Caribbean migration. Before I close, I want to reaffirm the centrality of 1981 and the multiple rebellious acts of the Thatcher years more broadly, by briefly attending to its historical context. Rather than a sudden outburst of resistance, the invocation of what Linton Kwesi Johnson would call the Great Insurrection brings to bear the dissident trends of Black thought and action, which considered and treated the state as a belligerent force. A decade before these rebellions took place, lifelong anti-racist Darcus Howe at the infamous anti-racist, anti-police mangrove protests exclaimed on the top of a makeshift podium that, quote, Black people have been caught up in complaining to police about police, complaining to magistrates about magistrates, complaining to judges about judges, complaining to politicians about politicians. We have become the shapers of our destiny as from today. This anti-state sentiment captures the norms and values of Black radicalism in the period which preceded the anti-police uprisings in Brixton, Bristol, Toxteth, Handsworth, Tottenham, and Manchester. Black politics were indeed shifting. Diagnoses of societal white supremacy made demands for acceptance politically incoherent, while assimilationism appeared to pathologize otherness rather than offer a palliative to the socially induced misery wrought by racism. This conjunctural rupture breathed new life into radical politics, calling into question not Blackness, but a society which rejected Black humanity. This is precisely what Stuart Hall considered the turning point which saw the militant abandonment of the, quote, liberal assimilationist dream in the face of persistent racism. A. Sivanandan, writing in 1976, saw these shifts as the product of the, quote, militant struggles in the Caribbean community. Persistent police harassment, a protracted housing crisis, which is, ongoing, but was especially severe, and the relegation of Black children to educationally subnormal schools led Sivanandan to conclude that, quote, the state was faced against all its convictions with an unassimilable Black community. The rhetoric of Black power in Britain, which connected itself directly to the streets, began not just to implicate the state, as previous forms of activism had done, but fundamentally reject its authority. The ballot box was considered a, quote, capitalist hoax, and the police as the state apparatus of terror. The London-based Black Power Movement collective cemented these values in 1970 by boldly asserting, Black people must not vote. Instead, we must organize ourselves effectively to destroy this racist capitalist system for our liberation. These anti-state commitments would inform the next decade of political organizing against the brutality and very existence of the police. These norms were on full display as the state began to expand its coercive forces and clamp down on Black life throughout the Thatcher years. I'm claiming then that the multiple overlapping and indeed necessary acts of resistance in the 1980s were in part made possible and at least coherent by more than a decade of radical politics which fundamentally rejected the state's power and function. Collectively, these acts of resistance constituted some of the largest scale rebellions in modern British history. The active concealment of their detail and historical backdrop are an active attempt to veil the centrality of racism and state violence from the history of this island. Bill's insistence on the historical salience of Black rebellion is thus a viable means to unsettle established histories and reassess the meaning and position of race in British society. In the wake of the Brixton Rebellion, Stuart Hall would publish the short essay, Summer in the City, in September 1981. He informed readers in no uncertain terms of the urgency of the moment, concluding that, quote, the police Black front line is the front line. Policing and the drift into an authoritarian social control of frontline issues. Hall went on to condemn the Labour Party and the left more broadly, contending that Her Majesty's loyal opposition, as he called them, is unable to take the side of the people, the oppressed elements in society, as it does not seem to have a clue what such a response would require. Here in 2022, our castle state is set to expand. Police powers are growing through bills. Even the most reactionary voices have questions, and immigration detentions flourish. as the current opposition to this authoritarianism is a former head of public prosecutions who has recently confirmed his desire to arrest more protesters, I find it fitting to sign off as Hall did in 81. We are, comrades, in grave danger. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to the coming discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Saima, would you like to share your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you to Bill for this incredibly rich and thought-provoking presentation, and to Caine and the Hutchins Centre team for the invitation to respond. I'll try to keep this shorter than I'd planned. There are so many things that we could further explore from that paper and from Caine's response, but I'd like to draw attention to two main discussion points in the short time that I have. So firstly, Bill began his paper by reflecting on the displacement of race, whereby racial whiteness in Britain has been lived as the non-racial norm. It is encouraging to see how attentive Bill's paper is to the need to not only think and talk about race in Britain in all of its complexity, but to also abandon the radical thoughtlessness which assists in creating a void in public consciousness about race as a universally lived experience. Bringing attention to this disavowal of race then is both important and urgent. As Bill has written elsewhere, whiteness in Britain is often a mediated, understated identification. Whiteness rarely needs to be made explicit. Its modes of transmission are unnoticed, as white was and arguably still is the norm. But the limitations of disassociation in this way are glaringly obvious in a number of case studies that Bill highlights, and I think 1981 is one of the most interesting here. Because 1981, we see a collection of major events taking place: the New Cross Massacre in January, the Black People's Day of Action in March, and in April, the Great Insurrection, the Brixton, Manchester, and Birmingham uprisings. And one of the questions that I think Bill's paper speaks to is that if, as in 1981, whiteness was at the heart of racism in Britain, why are issues of race and racism portrayed as a Black problem? In media representations, as well as political and public discourse, news of physical but also state violence aimed primarily at people of African descent sought to explain it as a product of increasing Black migration, as well as a deviant working class masculinity. Left out of this discussion is whiteness. We can see that Black victims of racism are made hyper-visible, while white perpetrators are kept invisible. And there is a power in this invisibility. As the poet and activist Linton Kwesi Johnson observes, when incidents of racism make the news, even activists and protesters really emphasize the victim's innocence and vulnerability. In other words, the victim becomes the whole story, and in doing so, Black people themselves are depicted as the source of racism. This impossible situation was identified by the American sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois in 1897 when he asked, "How does it feel to be a problem?" In an attempt to salvage myths about what Britishness stood for, i.e. the ethical state, Kennetta Hammond Perry therefore argues that a mystique of British anti-racism subsequently took hold. This mystique, she argues, depends upon a willful denial of the place of race and racism in British society. How then, as Bill asks, do we confront the politicisation of these self-congratulatory historical narratives of British abolitionism? Bill's paper then helps us to think through these pervasive silences regarding race and racism in Britain. While narratives about British abolitionism have, as Perry also notes, become the conduit through which Britain has imagined and caricatured itself internationally as a tolerant, liberal, morally virtuous, anti-racist nation, Bill's paper, I think, critically anchors these conversations about the expansion in police, prison, and border power. It shows the importance of race in the distribution of rights and resources and how power operates in multiple domains and various spatial configurations. I know Caine has talked about constructions of race in relation to state violence, so I'll turn to issues of state power instead, because another important thing happened in 1981. A long tradition of racial violence breathed new life into a desire for a more tight definition of Britishness by the Thatcherite government. As Radhika Natarajan's work thoughtfully demonstrates, whereas in 1968 Enoch Powell's views led to his dismissal as Shadow Secretary of State for Defence, Margaret Thatcher's focus on how many immigrants were too many arguably won her election as Prime Minister in 1979. And it was thought that Thatcher spoke for the silent majority and their fears about racial others, again speaking to Bill's observation concerning disassociation. So when we consider state racism and state violence, as the brilliant work of scholars such as Adam Elliott Cooper does, it is also important to reflect, I think, on the fact that in 1981, Thatcher's government passed the British Nationality Act, which defined British citizenship for the first time in law. At the most straightforward level, the Nationality Act of 1981 regulated the acquisition of British nationality by birth, descent, and adoption. Only those born in Britain or the children and grandchildren of those born in Britain possessed the right to enter. And so the Act was thus a culmination of the exclusionary rhetoric relating to categories of Britishness and the question of who belongs. These exclusions were fully understood by the time by Commonwealth citizens who equated immigration laws with their standing in Britain. And so Thatcher's claim to Britishness for white Britons demonstrably ignored the imperial formations of its basic principles and previous notions of multiracial Britishness. And so this brings me to my second observation about the Windrush scandal and the forces of state racism in operation today. As Bill shows, the nature of Britishness and who is not British remains essential to contemporary debates on immigration and multiculturalism. We can, for instance, see the echoes of Thatcher's Britishness in the most recent hostile environment, which defends an exclusive Britishness from the threat of immigrant cultures. In many ways, Bill's thoughts on Windrush help us to develop a more expansive account of state racism in important ways. As the Windrush scandal unfolded, it prompted an international outpouring of sympathy and a national dialogue about race and citizenship in post-war Britain. The question of second-class citizenship for Black and Brown Britons and who counts as a citizen took, in many ways, centre stage in public responses to the scandal. But very little was actually said about race and racialization itself. As the anti-immigrant racist politics of the last few decades have culminated in the now routine banishment of Black Britons, it is important to recognise, as Luke D. Nohona urges us to, that migration is not something that happened back then, but is an ongoing process in which people continue to move. And so migrant communities are illegalised and criminalised in new and different ways. Indeed, these struggles over movement and exclusion are precisely what reconfigures the racial and racist character of the British polity today, as in earlier generations. Bill's work thus demands a rethinking, I think, of the relationship between punitive criminal justice policies and aggressive immigration controls. And some of the questions that these discussions leave us with might then include: in what ways can we offer a portrait of multiracial Britain, not just in terms of its interactions with the state, but also in the quotidian ways in which people live with and across difference? In what ways do the pervasive silences around race serve to erase Black experiences? And how do we shatter the illusion that anti-Black racism is something foreign to Britain? And finally, is the Windrush scandal just the visible tip of a system designed to create communities of belongers and to exclude others? Thank you very much.
Thank you. So all three of you, thank you. My head is spinning with different thoughts, but I prefer, Bill, do you want to respond? I'm just checking to see if we have any hands raised right now, but do you want to, while we wait for people to formulate a couple of questions, do you want to respond to those points?
Let me just say two things quickly. One, I completely apologize for going on for so long. I didn't know that there's something awful about this virtual thing that I feel divorced me. So I was just talking to, it was awful. I'm really sorry.
No. But we wanted to hear all of it.
Really,
we wanted to hear all of it. Please don't apologize.
I mean, I would very much like to read your two papers. We should read them all together at some point and just think, because they are really, I just thought you two were fabulous. But you both raise a question fundamentally of the state. And we absolutely need to go back and think about the state. And so much talk about race and racism just it either takes the state as kind of naturalized and there and doesn't need any questioning, or it ignores it. But I am well persuaded by listening to you two, we have to get back and put the state there. And then, as Caine raises, that also connects to questions about political practice. What on earth do we do with the state? There is, as Caine has been saying for years, you know, this black radical kind of libertarian, kind of anarchist tradition. It's very complex, and that needs absolute careful reconstruction. So I trumpet someone like Stuart Hall. Yeah, I ask, well, in what sense was he part of the state, and in what sense was he absolutely would have nothing to do with it? And it's a very complex question. I love all this, you know, and I hope that what we said, Abby, wasn't too far removed from your North American sense of what we're up to. We should have maybe been more careful. I apologize for that as well.
Not at all. I mean, I actually, no, please don't apologize. I think we need to, we clearly need to learn more about Black Britain, about England in this country. I'm going to start things off with a hopelessly American question, and I can't even believe I'm about to utter her name, but, you know, Meghan Markle. Hopelessly American question, I realize, but I think she did, her situation, her resistance, her, you know, speaking out against the royal family and, you know, the aftermath of that did call some attention to issues that Americans, I think most Americans don't, or North Americans don't usually think about in relation to England. And I'm wondering if you can feel free to dismiss this question too, but I'm just wondering how kind of shining a brighter light on these issues outside of England might, has it helped things along at all? Has it made situation worse in England? You also have your first, you know, prime minister of color now. I mean, there's a lot happening in England that Americans do like to eat up, and so I'm wondering how that can be used productively.
Yeah. Well, I'm the last person in the world who should talk about Meghan Markle because I can't get my head around her. But all I will say is that the response from the royal family to her kind of very oblique criticisms of the royal family for being racist, when they all got up and said, the royal family isn't racist. When they said that, and this was, I think it was from the Duke of Edinburgh, was still alive. Well, no one in the 21st century can actually say the Duke of Edinburgh wasn't racist. I mean, it wasn't that he was mildly racist, he was full frontal racist, you know? So I just thought extraordinary, but you're absolutely right that Meghan Markle is important in the stories. Simon? Caine?
I would just say that I very briefly that I would say her prominence was actively negative. She became the only thing that was race in Britain. You know, no one at the same time it was found out that Black women were some ridiculous high number more likely to die in childbirth. That's a specifically working class experience, and the media cycle was consumed by an American millionaire. So for me, it was actively negative for those of us actively engaged in anti-racism, and her prominence kind of allowed us to, you know, Black working class people more broadly to, you know, have even less say in these discourses. So I would say it was a negative, but I completely agree that it definitely made issues of race in Britain more relevant to North American audiences. But the problem is that it took, again, essentially a celebrity who married into the royal family for certain people to care about us. That's got a whole set of questions around that as well.
Yeah, I think, yeah, thank you. I really she's not someone who I give much thought to, but in this context, she popped into my mind. But I think also it goes back to what you were saying, but that, and what you just said, Caine, that what you formulated, Bill, as the kind of lens of or the benevolence, that this is how race is looked at. And that's the state, so that the British royal family could deny its racism.
Yeah.
And while, as you just pointed out, Caine, ignoring the daily struggles, the daily pain, the daily death of Black people. And that, I mean, that is something that Americans also in this country, or people in this country, have some experience of seeing as well, I would say. Are there other questions, not about Meghan Markle?
No, it was a good time.
Yeah, I see a hand up. Gloria Emeguali, please. Hello, welcome.
Yeah, well, I have to say that Meghan Markle, that factor is important, because I think it also pushed William and that faction of the royal family to rebrand. And so if you're talking about Windrush, and you got to put that in the story there when they're trying to say, oh, I wrote down the quote, without you all, we would not be blah, blah, blah. I think this is also a direct reaction. Yeah. And remember, sibling rivalry is also ideological kind of conflict between the two factions, and an expose. And I think it's very crucial in the discussion. I agree, though, that it could also serve to sort of divert attention, but it's that's just I still consider it very important. The other thing too is that the election of the first Asian/Black Prime Minister is something that we've got to bring into the story now, because it would lead to, again, some, I'm still trying to figure out the manifestations or the repercussions, but it's definitely going to be part of the whole story. Is he going to be a continuation of Priti Patel's type of, drift? In which case it would be more of the same as such, or is there going to be some attempt to divert into a different direction? And whatever happens, it would be part of the story, part of the account, part of the narrative. So that's how I look at it. Thank you.
Thank you. Absolutely.
Thank you so much. I'm wondering, while I think we'll go a few minutes longer if we can, as long as none of you has a hard out. But I'm wondering what, if any of you could recommend to to those of us who are interested in learning more, and sometimes do so through the lens of culture separated a little bit from politics. What are some of the our British films, and I know the answer to this actually, but what British films, novels, TV series are taking up some of these questions, and are any of those, can you think of any that are doing so in a way that you find productive? Excuse me.
Saima, go on.
Yeah, I was just thinking of Steve McQueen's Small Axe series, which I get my students to watch and can watch several times over. It's a really sensitive, really nuanced and complex portrayal of Black British life. There's a celebration of Black joy, but there's also those kind of very tough experiences of racism and that. So yeah, I would definitely recommend that series.
I would
Go ahead.
Open up the question a bit more. I think that there is, especially from North America, looking at Black Britain, there's this kind of assumption that the adherence to a national identity is symmetrical. I'd say that the Caribbean West Africa especially is so incredibly important. So like, you know, the Black British historical canon, for example, has as much Eric Williams, and Walter Rodney, etc., as it does of people who were born here. So I'd say, the kind of question would, which is a great one, assumes that there is this kind of African Americanness about Black Britishness, if that makes sense. Whereas I think that the Caribbean, not to say that the Caribbean is not relevant for African Americans, because that would be entirely inaccurate. It's about the canons here, the films, the music. The 2020 protests, for example, I heard, Dennis Brown. All of these things were more relevant than a specifically kind of British canon, if that makes sense. So I saw a lot of people are returning to the classics, to Eric Williams, especially now, and not exclusively looking at the history of slavery, but a means to comprehend the relationship between the pursuit of profit and that augmentation, how that's augmentating relationships of race. And so I think there's a return to those classics, which is really important, and inspiring in generations. People are talking a lot more about Peter Fryer now, not as to read the narrative, but what was going on, what that kind of politically Black radical historicism that was born out of these rebellions in the 80s is becoming again relevant. I think we're reconsidering.
Did Caine just freeze for others?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
Okay.
The crucial point.
Exactly. Maybe he can come back. But are there any other thoughts or closing remarks? Oh, here's a question from one of our audience members in the chat. There were Africans in England in the 17th and 18th centuries. The 1619 arrival of Africans in Virginia is noted in American history. Was it just the Windrush critical mass that was considered the beginning of race in England? And I think part of that question might be, how was race present prior to Windrush in England? But maybe Bill, you can take that question.
No, I'll just say, simply within the white imagination, for centuries, decades, if not centuries, it was perfectly conceivable for white English people not to think in the category of whiteness. And it's a paradoxical, because it is that view is infused by race. It's a racialized perception which disavows race. It's this double complex, awful. And so when when generations of non-white migrants came to Britain, they couldn't quite figure out on what was being said and where race lay and where they stood in it and where these white folk stood. It's terribly, terribly complex. But no, I think the crucial thing about Windrush wasn't only numbers, although it was that, but this was also a moment when, at the end of the Second World War, when the fascist states had been defeated, Pan-Africanism was sweeping across the globe, and there was a real sense of black lives being realized, globally. I don't think it's possible to understand Windrush from a simple, small England point of view. I think you have to put it in a much wider global history, and then you get a sense that the dispositions of colonialism were shifting radically. And the old frontiers between colony and metropole were no longer held, everything was beginning to melt.
Yeah. Before we go, thank you, Bill. You were cut off a little. Did you want to finish your thought? You were just, I think, in the midst of talking about the return to Eric Williams. And I don't know if you were aware that you froze, but
yeah, I was eventually. I was just saying that I've been, in terms of what's particularly interesting now, is revisiting those older texts, looking at how they operate, as well as a rich tradition. I think the Steve McQueen, the Small Axe is the perfect example of film. There's a lot of bad race writing going out at the moment as well. There's an industry. There's like there's a big push to get these Black voices heard, and there's a lot of texts which miss the point fundamentally, but kind of buy into this Meghan Markle type lived experience as racism and anti-racism, rather than the old conception, which I think we've all expressed some critical nostalgia for, as anti-racism, as a completely kind of conception of a fundamentally different kind of world, which was when to be anti-racist was to be a socialist for a long time in a lot of people's eyes, and there is that work is kind of being undone slowly and continuously, and hopefully the return to the classics do something to, as I said before, reconnect those dots between race and class.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah. No, thank you. You've given us, I may ask the three of you for reading lists for myself. So just some basic syllabi for me to add to my bookshelf. So, but anyway, I think we'll call it off or end things right now. Thank you so much for being here, and for, I'm sorry that that Krishna wasn't able to host this, but I'm so thrilled that I had the opportunity to, because it was a fabulous discussion. And I just, this lapsed Victorianist is kind of eating this up right now. So anyway, thank you so much.
And thank you so much, and thanks to everyone.
Pleasure.
Okay.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Very good to see you.